Priscilla kept 11 years of ordinary living expenses in cash. Not invested. Not earning much of anything beyond whatever a basic savings account paid her, year after year. Just sitting, the way Walt's coupons sat folded in a kitchen drawer, waiting for an emergency that, most years, simply never came. Walt's discipline went into the wrong ledger, applied with real consistency for 3 decades. So did hers. It just took the shape of safety instead of savings, which made it even harder for anyone, including Priscilla herself, to recognize as the same underlying mistake. This series keeps finding the same failure, over and over, in different costumes, energy and real discipline, aimed at the bounded game, at the direct cost of the unbounded one. Today's costume, the emergency fund that grew far, far past the size of any emergency it could plausibly ever need to cover. A real emergency fund, 3 to 6 months of expenses, the number I gave you back in the automation order episode, protects you from a single bad month becoming a bad decade. It's not a large number, relative to a lifetime of earning, and building it is one of the earliest, highest priority rungs in the entire system I've laid out across this series. Priscilla had hers covered, completely, inside her first 2 years of serious saving, in her late 20s. I want to give you a real sense of who Priscilla was, because the number alone doesn't explain the 20 years that followed it. She worked as a hospital billing coordinator, the kind of job with a steady paycheck and a front-row seat to exactly how fast a family's finances can come apart when a medical bill arrives unannounced. She'd watched it happen to coworkers more than once, a surprise balance, a scramble, a payment plan that stretched on for years. That wasn't abstract to her. It was Tuesday afternoon paperwork she processed with her own hands, and it shaped what safety meant to her long before it ever became a number in her own account. She kept building the same cash pile for 2 more decades after that. Not out of a plan, exactly, more out of a feeling that never fully went away, a sense that more cash sitting visibly available always meant more safety, no matter how much was already there. Every raise, every bonus, every windfall got routed, by default, into the same account, the way water finds the same channel it's always found, without anyone redirecting it on purpose. There was a specific ritual to it, and once I understood the ritual, I understood the whole 20 years. On the first of every month, Priscilla logged into her bank's website, not to move money, but just to look at the balance. She told me it was the first thing she did some mornings, before coffee, the way another person might check the weather. Watching that number climb was, by her own description, the most reliably good feeling in her entire financial life, better than a raise, better than a bonus landing, because a raise or a bonus only felt good for a day. The balance just sat there, visible, all month, doing the feelings work for her without her having to do anything at all. Every dollar she added past the point of genuine protection wasn't buying her more safety. I want to be precise about this, because it's the part people resist hearing. There's a ceiling on how much safety a cash cushion can actually provide. Past a certain size, an emergency fund stops protecting you from disaster and starts quietly protecting you from growth instead, the exact same ceiling versus no ceiling structure from the very first video, just wearing the costume of caution this time instead of the costume of frugality. I asked her once, directly, why she kept adding to a cushion that had long since covered any emergency she could reasonably imagine. She said it made her feel like nothing could touch her. I understood the feeling. I don't think it was irrational, exactly, as a feeling. But a feeling of safety and actual financial safety are not the same instrument, the same way Renata's 11 columns and her actual net worth were not the same instrument, and mistaking one for the other, consistently, for 2 decades, has a real, calculable cost. What eventually changed things wasn't a crisis, and it wasn't a single conversation either. It was a slow accumulation of noticing, a friend's portfolio, grown modestly but steadily over the same 20 years, sitting where Priscilla's excess cash had sat instead, untouched by any market downturn Priscilla could point to as the reason she'd needed all that cash in the first place. She moved a portion over gradually, cautiously, the same caution that had built the pile in the first place, just finally redirected instead of simply accumulated. There was one real test of that cushion, about 9 years in, that I think tells you more than any of the numbers do on their own. Priscilla's car needed a new transmission the same month her roof needed emergency patching after a storm, two unrelated bills landing inside the same 30 days, close to $8,000 combined. It's a genuinely bad month, the exact scenario an emergency fund exists for. She paid it without a second thought, didn't touch her investments, didn't take on debt, felt nothing but mild annoyance at the timing. And that's the whole point, $8,000, drawn from a fund that held $220,000. The other $212,000 did absolutely nothing that month, the same as every month before or after it, because it was never going to be asked to. The myth is that cash and safety sit on the same single axis, and more of one is simply, automatically more of the other. They don't, and it isn't. Safety has a floor requirement, much the way frugality does. From the very first episode of this series, you need enough, a specific, calculable amount, and past enough, more cash isn't more safety at all. It's worth being just as honest about the opposite failure, because this series has a way of getting mistaken for a lecture aimed only at oversavers, and that's not the whole picture. I've met people on the other side of this line too, households with 6 weeks of expenses set aside, calling it an emergency fund, treating a single missed paycheck as a manageable inconvenience instead of the crisis it would actually become. That failure is real, and it's arguably more dangerous in the short term than Priscilla's, because it can turn one bad month into real, compounding debt at double-digit interest, undoing years of otherwise careful decisions in a matter of weeks. It's idle capital, sitting in a ledger that has stopped doing anything active for you, while inflation quietly, invisibly does something to it every single year it sits there untouched. The myth feels true because the underlying instinct, more cushion feels safer, is true up to a point, a real and important point. The mistake is not noticing when you've already passed that point, and continuing to apply the same instinct well beyond where it stopped adding anything at all. Put the undersaver and the oversaver side by side and the shape of the actual lesson gets sharper, not blurrier. Both are working from the same flawed mental model, that safety is measured only in the size of a number, rather than in the relationship between that number and an actual, calculated need. The person with 6 weeks saved hasn't calculated anything, they've just stopped short of being uncomfortable. Priscilla, on the other side, hasn't calculated anything either, she's just kept going well past the point of being uncomfortable. Enough was never about comfort in either direction. It was always about the number itself, sitting there, waiting to be calculated honestly instead of felt. I think this myth is especially sticky because, unlike most of the mistakes in this series, it doesn't feel like a mistake even in retrospect. Nobody looks at a large cash cushion and feels foolish the way they might looking back at an impulsive purchase. It looks, and feels, like prudence, indefinitely, no matter how large it grows, which means there's no natural moment where the behavior corrects itself the way overspending eventually forces its own correction. Excess caution, unlike excess spending, can run quietly for 20 years without ever announcing itself as a problem. I want to introduce someone briefly on the other side of this line, because the contrast sharpens the lesson instead of muddying it. A former co-worker of Priscilla's, at the same hospital, kept exactly 1 month of expenses set aside, treating anything beyond that as money better spent living. When her own transmission failed 2 years into that arrangement, she didn't have Priscilla's $8,000 sitting ready. She financed the repair on a card at 22% interest, then took 11 months to pay it off, paying more in interest alone than Priscilla's entire fund earned in a typical year of quietly sitting still. Neither woman had calculated her actual number. One drifted $180,000 too high. The other drifted 2 months too low. The lesson isn't save more or save less, it's that neither of them ever did the arithmetic that would have told them where the line actually was. Say the true emergency fund number, for a given household, honestly calculated, is $40,000. Priscilla held closer to $220,000. That excess, $180,000, sitting idle for 2 decades instead of invested, isn't a rounding error, and it isn't a hypothetical. At even a modest historical average return, that idle sum could have roughly tripled or more over that time, becoming real, substantial, life-changing money instead of a static number that never moved. Let me walk the arithmetic slowly, with round numbers, because the shape of the gap matters more than any single figure inside it. Put $180,000 into a plain, unremarkable index fund and leave it alone for 20 years at a conservative 7% average annual return, the kind of number this series has used before, nothing exotic. Year 5, it's already grown past $250,000. Year 10, past $350,000. Year 15, past $490,000. By year 20, it's crossed $690,000, not from any single brilliant decision, not from timing anything correctly, just from being left alone in the unbounded ledger instead of the bounded one, the exact same mechanism from Earl's 12%, scaled up and left running for the same 2 decades Priscilla spent checking a balance that never moved anywhere at all. Instead, it sat, protecting her from an emergency that a fraction of that amount, about a fifth of it, already fully covered, every single year, the entire time. The other 4/5 wasn't protecting her from anything real. It was simply declining to participate in the unbounded ledger, year after year, by choice, without her ever quite framing it to herself that way. Put the two numbers next to each other and hold them there for a moment. $40,000 is what genuine protection required. $220,000 is what she actually held. The gap between those two figures, compounding quietly at a modest rate for 20 years, is very plausibly a larger number than everything Walt lost across his entire 31-year story, which should tell you something about how widespread this particular costume of the same mistake actually is, hiding in plain sight, inside accounts that everyone, including financial advisors, tends to praise on sight rather than question. Here's one more way to feel the size of that gap, because dollar figures alone can go numb after a while. $180,000, compounding at a modest historical rate for 20 years, doesn't just become a bigger number, it becomes something close to an entire second retirement, sitting unused, in an account already labeled safety. Priscilla, by the time we spoke, had effectively worked 2 extra decades for money that was already sitting in her name the whole time, fully hers, simply never allowed to do the one thing money left alone for 20 years is uniquely good at doing. That's not a story about bad luck or a market that failed her. It's a story about capital that was never given permission to work. Priscilla wasn't reckless in reverse. I want to be exact about that. Nothing about this episode is arguing that caution itself is the problem. She was careful in a direction that stopped paying off, years and years after it stopped paying off, without any signal ever arriving to tell her so. Here's the part of Priscilla's story I've come to think matters most, and it happened only after she'd started moving money over. She told me the discomfort didn't fade the way she expected it to. The first transfer, a modest one, kept her up that night, checking a number that was now, for the first time in 20 years, capable of going down as well as up. That discomfort is real, and I don't want to wave it away the way some financial advice does. Safety, real safety, was never going to feel as immediately good as watching a savings balance climb in a straight line. It just does more, quietly, over a longer horizon than the feeling was ever built to measure. And that's the through line of this entire series, stated as plainly as I can state it, it was never about being less careful. Not with Walt, not with Ingrid, not with anyone this series has introduced you to. It's about noticing the exact point where care stops protecting you and starts quietly costing you instead, and having the honesty to move past that point deliberately, instead of treating more caution as automatically, permanently better, forever, regardless of how much of it you've already accumulated. I think about Priscilla and Earl together sometimes, because they arrived at the same underlying lesson from opposite directions. Earl needed almost no deliberate discipline at all, because the one decision he made was aimed correctly from the start. Priscilla needed an enormous amount of discipline, real, sustained, admirable discipline, and it still cost her, for 2 decades, because discipline was never the variable that was missing. Aim was. You can have all the willpower in the world, applied with total consistency, and still lose to inflation and lost growth for 20 straight years if the ledger you're pointing it at was never the right one to begin with. Zoom out across this whole series for a second, because Priscilla's story only fully lands next to the others. Walt aimed 3 decades of discipline at coupons instead of compounding. Earl, almost by accident, aimed 1 decision at the right ledger and barely had to think about money again. Renata mistook 11 columns of tracking for an actual financial plan. Priscilla mistook a growing cash number for growing safety. For different costumes, for different personalities, for completely different relationships with money, and underneath every single one of them, the same failure to ask a very short, very specific question: is this effort still buying me anything, past this exact point, or has it quietly stopped? There's an objection worth taking seriously: isn't it better to err on the side of too much safety, given how unpredictable real emergencies actually are? It's a reasonable instinct, and I don't want to dismiss it, because genuine unpredictability is real. But unpredictable doesn't mean unboundedly large. 3 to 6 months of expenses already accounts for real unpredictability: job loss, a medical event, a major repair, even several of these landing close together. What it doesn't require is decades of additional padding for emergencies that, statistically, simply don't scale with the size of your cushion. A cushion 5 times larger than necessary doesn't protect you from a 5 times larger emergency. Most real emergencies have a fairly bounded cost, whether your cushion is $40,000 or $400,000. It helps to actually name the emergencies people picture when they defend an oversized cushion, because naming them exposes how bounded they really are. A job loss, realistically, costs 3 to 9 months of expenses before a new paycheck arrives, the exact range the standard fund already covers. A major medical event, even a serious one, is bounded by an insurance out-of-pocket maximum in most real cases, a specific, calculable ceiling, not an open-ended number. A major home repair, a roof or a furnace, runs into the thousands, rarely the hundreds of thousands. None of the emergencies people actually cite, when you ask them to be specific instead of general, requires anywhere near $220,000 sitting in cash. The fear is real. The math behind the fear, once you make it specific, almost never is. The honest fix isn't abandoning caution. It's calculating your actual number once, specifically, for your actual life, not a headline figure, not a round number that feels safe, and treating anything meaningfully beyond that number as available for the unbounded ledger instead of frozen indefinitely in the bounded one, the same 2-question discipline from the dead episode, just pointed at a cushion instead of a loan. If you want a concrete starting point tonight, it's this: write down your actual monthly essential expenses, housing, food, insurance, the utilities you can't skip, multiply by the number of months of coverage that lets you sleep, somewhere between 3 and 6 for most households, and that's your number. Not a feeling. Not a round figure that sounds responsible at a dinner party. A specific number, calculated once, that you can hold up against whatever you're currently holding in cash and ask, honestly, whether the difference between the two is still doing any protective work at all, or whether it's just sitting there the way Priscilla's was, out of habit instead of purpose. If you want to actually run Priscilla's version of the 2-question test this week, here's the shape of it, concretely. First question: what is my real number, calculated honestly from my actual monthly essentials, not estimated from a feeling? Second question: what do I currently hold in cash, and is the difference between those 2 figures still doing protective work, or has it been sitting untouched for years, the way Priscilla's had? If the gap is small, you're already fine, and nothing here applies to you. If the gap looks like Priscilla's, 5 times your number, 6 times more, that gap has a name. It's not safety anymore. It's an unopened opportunity, sitting exactly where you left it, waiting for you to finally ask the question you've been avoiding. There's a cousin to this mistake, on the income side instead of the savings side, someone whose paycheck kept growing, year after year, raise after raise, and whose actual financial position never grew to match it at all. That story's next, and the gap in that one might be the hardest of all to see happening while it's actually happening to you.